I will say, by the way, that this has been an amazing weekend for me. I have learned so much. I told Lee yesterday how ashamed I am, how little I know really of Arthur Morgan, or knew of Arthur Morgan. I know a lot more now, and plan to spend some of my retirement reading more about him. I feel really honored to be in an organization that was founded by him. Other thoughts from conference committee or panelists? John, Lee, Rose?
Well, I feel slightly guilty because it's not clear how much I'm representing Arthur Morgan and how much I'm just representing myself. I sort of feel I sort of feel like I'm hitchhiking on Arthur Morgan to plug my own stuff, and so I just feel a little guilty. That's all. You should know that.
I don't think you have anything to feel guilty about, Lee. Really enjoyed your presentation, and I can see in all the Morgan grandchildren that I know, I can see a lot of resemblance to all, with all the language we're hearing, except for the humor, which you exhibit so well, and which apparently Arthur did not. So
he had a sense of humor, but it was very dry.
Okay. Yeah. Don.
I had not centered it all on the progressive era, and you can trace various things that I identify as Arthur Morgan, apparently from other thinkers in the progressive era. So I need to educate myself about that.
Thank you, Don. And Rose? Or yes, go ahead, Larry. And Rose, maybe we could just unmute everyone now, if you could. Okay, Rose is unmuting folks, so you might want to mute yourself if you're not speaking. But Larry, you're up next when you do get unmuted. There you go. There you go.
Yeah, I just had a question for you, Lee. It sounds like you were doing things right by the end of when you had the collapse, and it sounded like what brought you down was the banks being unable to tolerate a little uncertainty. Do you think it could have gone differently?
I wonder about that. Larry, it's an extremely good question. And the banks were correct that the ESOP repurchase obligation was a huge issue. If we had not gone into bankruptcy, I assume that the value of the stock would have plummeted and the employees would have had very little in their accounts anyway. So I would have gone from hero to bum and not been able to blame the banks. Now, to what degree, I think the company could have survived, but it would have been so radically changed. And we knew that Creative Memories couldn't go on indefinitely. So we had lots of business ideas that we tried. And as I mentioned to Susan the other day, I can come up with $100,000 idea. I can come up with $1 million, but I had to come up with a $200 million idea, and I couldn't pull it off to replace the disappearing sales. And the other company that went down with the same problem was Eastman Kodak. They could not come up with a way to replace the gold mine of silver-based film when digital photography came in. And that's kind of what happened to us fundamentally. And in Eastman Kodak's case, pieces of that company survived. And the Antioch company's case, a few pieces survived. But if you looked at the record of all the failures I had trying to find a sequel, it's rich.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lee, and thanks, Larry, for that good question. Brooke, Kevin, and Rose from our education panel are here. Did you have any thoughts for what you have learned over the course of the weekend, or any additional comments. And I did want to point to everyone also to the chat, where Ken, a former caretaker of AEM, says he can attest to Arthur Morgan's humor, dry as it was. So that's really good to know.
I would just speak to, I couldn't attend the entire weekend, but I would just underscore what I think I heard Don and Lee kind of speak to. Don saying, considering Arthur Ernest Morgan within the context of his day and the movements of thought at that time, and in terms of thinking about the impact of changing technologies on businesses and where landscapes and horizons are sort of opened or become more closed. I have oftentimes thought in town, just living in Yellow Springs broadly for a couple decades, that we have these greats that we think about. We have these heroes. We almost have like a hero mentality, right? Where we point back to, if only Antioch could have another president like Arthur Morgan with the vision, or, even Yellow Springs will say, if only we had a leader like, and I think that this is part of, I think it's normal to think this way, like we look to someone to come with the vision. And the more and more I learn about Arthur Morgan, it's the vision is never in one person only. No matter how brilliant that person is, they always have to surround themselves and build networks of strength. And I think that that's a testament. When I look at the legacy, it's really about the networks that have built themselves around some of those core ideas that taprooted some of the institutions. And so if we're gonna think today in closing about, okay, great, what do we do now? Or what do we focus on now? Or what's the next step? I think for me, it's really about, well, where are our networks of strength? And I appreciate Agraria's focus on regenerative, community strategies, because that I think is really what it comes down to. Like, where are our networks of strength in higher ed, in business, in ecological management and resources? Where are the networks of strength, or how could we build them from the nodes that we do have, which I think is really the work that we're involved in, most of us here today.
Thanks, Brooke. That's a really beautiful comment. Thank you. Kevin or Rose, and I recognize John Morgan, you haven't said anything yet in closing either, if you're interested.
Well, I would just maybe share that learning about Arthur Morgan helped me to position him in relation to an area that I study. I focus on a lot in my research, which is African-American history in the late 19th century, early 20th century. That Arthur Morgan's educational philosophy intersects with the philosophies of W.E.B. Du Bois and with Booker T. Washington. We view those as very different people. Du Bois was pretty much a contemporary of Arthur Morgan. He lived a long life too. Du Bois was born in 1868 and died in 1963. His educational philosophy was on both liberal arts, but also on one part of Arthur Morgan's philosophy focused on education with a social purpose. And I think that's in part what we mean when we talk about social justice today. It's a different language, but it has the same meaning, I think. That is very similar to Du Bois. Du Bois wanted liberal arts education, but also a practical outcome with it. And he also critiqued Booker T. Washington. Washington, you may know, he died in 1915. He was born in 1856. He comes to fame by promoting practical education for Black people in emancipation and discouraging political participation. And Du Bois, and he has such a focus on practical and money that almost to the detriment of politics and really social justice. And Du Bois critiques Washington by saying that in the book, The Souls of Black Folks, that Washington is a person who only believes in dusty dollars and smartness. And when I was reading about Arthur Morgan, he really did believe in economic equity. And he talked about not amassing huge fortunes, and he wasn't perfect, I'm not saying that, but positioning him for me in terms of African-American history as well is, I think it's important to think about who his contemporaries were from that point of view. When we move forward to what does this mean for us now, yesterday during the education panel, I mentioned that in the last few years at Antioch, we've begun using the phrase of applied liberal arts. And that is just, I think, an update on what Arthur Morgan was doing. The other part that he focused on a lot was ethical education. He also talked about moral education. And Antiochians, even in the 20s and 30s, I think, pushed back on the moral education piece because there's so many different ways to define that. But the ethical education, which is use your education with honesty and integrity, that's something that we need more of now. And he would be very much, I think that belief would be very important. I've done some talks lately about this supposed critical race theory controversy, which is manufactured. And it has its roots in a lack of integrity of people who are claiming something that they know isn't true. And that's something that, unfortunately, a fair amount of people now seem to believe you should use your educational knowledge in whatever way will serve you, rather than honestly and with integrity. And so in those ways, I think what he believed would really, it resonates with what we need today.
Kevin, I really appreciate that insight. I think it would be awesome to write an article about that. Maybe we should talk about that. That's really, I totally agree about how education is being used today. So yeah, thank you for that great comment. Rose, did you want to share anything? Maybe that's a no. And how about you, John, or April? I know April asked me to do the closing panel because of her coughing, but John, did you have anything you wanted to share? I guess that's also, or we can't hear you, John, you're muted, unless you're saying no.
Still muted, John. There.
There you go.
Yeah, they kept telling me the host needed to unmute me. Okay. Well, one thing that came to my mind yesterday in the discussion of eugenics is that it seems to me an example of many things that where there's qualities and interests that can have a good side, can also have a backside. And it comes along with part of the liberal or left agenda of trying to figure out how to make things better, but sometimes it can go in a wrong direction. And it's one thing that is similar, it seems to me, to what happens when Democratic presidents want to take us to war, and so they always say, well, we've got to go to save these these people who are being hurt by somebody, and so that's the way they get the liberal and left base to support wars. And also, and this may be a little too controversial to bring up, but I think there are current active elements that just are descended from the eugenics movement in the past that are involved with the COVID agenda, but maybe that's too controversial to get into that.
Thank you, John, for sharing that.
Okay.
Let's see, Don Hollister, you were on the organizing committee. Any comments about the weekend?
Well, besides restating the relevance of that progressive era that Morgan came through, I was taken by something that Brooke just said about what are our current networks, or how are we developing networks. One of the huge resources or strengths to me that Antioch has is its networks. And I'm not sure how many people currently engaged at Antioch are in those networks. So there's like perhaps a disjunction between Antioch-ness and Antioch faculty. Doesn't have to stay that way, but there's a huge strength in the experience and interconnection. I mean, whatever that was called, the road guide for, Antioch Moocher's Guide. So you could go couch surfing. Well, intellectually, you can do the same thing in this country. There's Antiochians engaged in so many things, and maybe retired but not dead. Resources for 20 more years in terms of intellectual interaction or political inspiration.
Thank
And this conference is an example.
Thank you so much, Don. Regu, are you still, I'm really impressed that you're still here. If you are, would you like to say anything? Or maybe not, it must be 1 a.m. there now. Okay, I see, Rich, you have your hand raised. Oh, there's Regu, sorry. Go, Rich, do you mind if Regu says something first? Sorry, go ahead, Regu. I think you are unmuted. There you go.
Yeah. Now I am unmute. So I have partly attended today and partly attended yesterday. Thank you very much for the learning. In fact, this conference is an opportunity for me to review the literature of what has been written about Arthur Morgan as well as about Vishwanathan. It is a learning for me, and it is an inspiration for me to sustain the community visualized and established in Mitraniketan. And also, I would like to say that now we used to say that we should think locally and act globally and act locally and think globally. Now, that has been visualized by Arthur Morgan in 1950s in his writings. Now it become very relevant because of this climate change and all those things. So the man who visualized it in 50 years ago, and also his writings are very relevant today. So I'm happy I have learned a lot of things. I met some of my old friends also. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Regu. We're so glad you joined us. Dawn, I appreciated you sharing about things that you had learned over the course of the weekend. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share?
You know, I was just glancing at my notes to see, thinking you might call on me, but yeah, I think I'm drawing from what Brooke said and that Don kind of added on to and thinking of the peer review that I brought up in my presentation. Yeah, it's a community, right? Like it is and I talked about engineers being problem solvers, and that's my mindset, you know, when I come to work, what's the problem today that I have to address and I have to fix? Doing it together as a group, you're going to get better results and you're going to get lasting results. And so that's really, and I really wish I would have been around for the eugenics discussion yesterday. I had seen some of that in Arthur Morgan's background, but I really have not dug into it. So that's motivated me, to go do a little more reading and research on him. But just in general, I really appreciate, from what I know, his approach to problem solving, and I think that's something all of us can learn. And it's not me. It's not I did this. It's the best results are when it's a group of us.
Yeah, thank you, Don, for reiterating that. And Lee put that in his presentation as well, so how much Morgan surrounded himself by good people.
Mhm.
So, Rich, sorry, I'm getting back to you now.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you. So many threads. I'm really appreciating all that I've learned. I think I've told some of you, Arthur Morgan gave the commencement address at All New Friends School the year I graduated, and I hardly heard a word as a 17-year-old, and I got a chance to read that address within the last year, and it was really loaded. Focus was on integrity, but I'm picking up on a lot of the summary comments, as well as seeing the threads. There's so many. Brooke talks about the networks, and I think those networks were vitally important for the success that Arthur Morgan achieved. And they are, as Don says, those are the network communities that form the basis for the next stage of growth. Arthur Morgan was a pioneer. He was ahead of his time, but the times are not that far from the work that he provided. Don Hollister said 50 years ago, we thought the planet was collapsing, and we did. So many of us were aware of the issues. Well, the planet is and has and is, and it is pushing us on to a different stage, a stage that I think has been envisioned by the work that Arthur Morgan did. So lots of appreciation for all the work that went into putting all this together, because I think anyone who participated learned a lot, and someone would be, well, the next chapter of Arthur Morgan's legacy is yet to be written.
There are some wonderful writers on this call, so maybe that's a call to arms. I'm going to call Rose in 1 second, but one of the things that I didn't mention at the beginning of this is that the conference committee talked about having proceedings out of this. We recognize that there is probably going to be there would be a lot of very interesting information presented, and there may be opportunities to think about how else to get it out besides the conference. Okay, Rose, you're up.
Hi everyone, I've been running tech, sorry. So if it's another technical glitch pops up, I may have to disappear on you again. So yeah, I feel like I really want to echo a lot of what's already been said, in terms of like the focus on community. And Arthur Morgan, like, as compelling and inspirational as his writing and his ideas were, like, he was very much like, even in his own philosophy, was like, I don't do any of this alone. None of us do any of this alone. We live in communities, and these are group efforts. And he was part of like larger movements and in conversation. And especially I thought some of the history that Emily Seibel talked about in her presentation about land trusts and about Bob Swan, and also like Slater King taking the correspondence course that Arthur provided, and just like all these connections that like across people who probably never even probably never even met Morgan, but like these sort of connections and contemporary thinkers and how many movements were kind of all happening together, and sort of like, you know, trends and movements throughout history that happen. I just think it's so cool. And then, yeah, I mean, Don, if it makes you feel better, there are still plenty of Antioch networks. They just mostly happen on the internet now. I still have Antiochians who like send me papers to read. I worked as a tutor in the writing center, and I still have like graduates who are like, hey, can you maybe look at my cover letter? Haven't talked to you in a year and a half, but if you would at all be willing. And I think it's wonderful. And like, I'll run it when I was like living in Austin, I was giving a tour at the job I worked there, and ran to this guy who graduated in like the one of the guys on the tour was an Antioch graduate from like the 80s, and we had a talk about Antioch, what was different, what was the same. So I mean, I think that it's still out there, and I think that there are just so many different types of community, and that like there's that type, and then there's very much like, as some of the speakers were bringing up, the like local Yellow Springs type, and the people who like live in the same place and like can spend years together and know each other's grandparents or grandchildren, and that kind of sense of deep-rooted place and deeper relationship. I think that both communities kind of have their own their place and their value. And then in terms of education, yeah, I mean, I think the history of education is so interesting and often so depressing, but the sort of debates that happen that like keep coming up, you know, and the way the pendulum swings back and forth, and how I think education is another area that yeah, there's just like a lot of political nature in history. Sorry, I'm like monitoring like 4 things on my screen while I'm also speaking, so I'm a little distracted, but I really appreciate all this perspective Kevin gave, and about that contemporaries and those histories as well. And then, yeah, just thinking again about viewing important figures in history as whole people, like, so eugenics, of course, being the example that we have brought up a lot in the conference, but like, you know, that absolutely there are flaws within progressive people, within progressive movements, and as also as I'm sorry, if it was, I don't know if it was Lee or John who mentioned, like, you know, like the different motivations for war, how you like get progressives to jump on, like, you know, which is normally like in historically not considered a progressive value, this war, but it's like, oh, we need to go save people, we need to go help people, and how you can, and how like how the patterns of these ideas happen and how susceptible certain movements are, and to like, and how learning about that and learning about how whole people and whole movements and sort of like what held them back is sort of how we need to, is like the most important part of like the benefit of looking at things from a historical perspective and addressing how we can go forward now. I think that's what I have for now. I don't know if anyone had specific things they wanted me to speak to, but I've enjoyed myself. I love learning about local history. I feel like some of the speakers have been absolutely wonderful. Thank you all for coming. We will be sharing slides if they've been sent to me. So if you're a speaker on this call who has not sent me your slides yet, and you'd be willing to share them, please send them to me. And also Rose, I'll put my email address, but rose@communitysolution.org. So if you have any follow-up questions, anything that came up in this conference that you want to chat with me about, you can go ahead and email me, and I'll put that in the chat here.
Great, thank you so much, Rose. John, did you have something else you wanted to say? You're still muted, John. John, you're still muted. There you go.
Okay. It kept saying the host wouldn't let me unmute myself. I just was thinking of one other example of seeming opposites that both have their place, which has to do with the engineering. Don talked so well about the importance of the careful planning, and but I also remember, I guess it was probably apropos of the TVA work, Arthur Morgan talking about what he called dynamic design, where they actually started work before the plans were done, because he knew there would be unexpected things that they would run into that they could incorporate into the design. So it allowed him to be flexible. And I think he may have compared that a little bit with what he thought the Army engineers made a mistake of just locking everything in and not taking into account unforeseen circumstances
Thank you, John. That's a very interesting dichotomy, or probably not a dichotomy. Kevin, go ahead.
I wasn't able to attend the 11:45 panel, but I'm particularly interested in Arthur Morgan's vision of small communities. Before I moved into academia, I worked in community development, nonprofit real estate development for a long time. And about 4 years ago, Monica Hasek, who was then director of the Wellness Center, and I were asked to work on the Antioch College Village housing development that was going to be housing adjacent, on land adjacent to the college. And in conjunction with that, a student, Santiago Gariepi, asked me to do an independent study because he was interested in this development. He wanted to learn about it. And so we used Arthur Morgan's book on small communities as the text, and then used the housing development to talk about, well, what does this mean for Yellow Springs? And the Antioch College Village development eventually was mothballed because of our other challenges. But the vision that Arthur Morgan has about self-contained communities, I don't think is utopian. I think it did happen here. And a lot of you here know it, that Yellow Springs had major employers. And when I think about, I've been working on a lot of projects about African-American history. The reason why there's a strong Black leadership class in Yellow Springs in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was, I believe, in large part because there were employment opportunities, and they weren't just menial jobs like my parents were in Toledo at that point. My father's a teacher, my mother's a nurse, but Toledo overall did not have that concentration of jobs. And that meant that parents could raise children who went to college and not have to leave here. And even if we look at the community more broadly, to be able to have a wide range of jobs has a lot to do with those employment opportunities like Brene, YSI. And I'm not saying Arthur Morgan was behind all of those, but understanding that. And now people seem to think that small communities can't do that. And I believe they can. And because companies can go anywhere now. And there's some real reasons why some companies might want to be here. We now have Yellow Springs Development Corporation that is charged with doing some of that. But I think that's going to be critical in terms of what Yellow Springs looks like in the future, because we're on our way to becoming a bedroom community, high-priced bedroom community. And I think drawing on that vision to attract employers that have living wage jobs is going to really be important. And that's something that Arthur Morgan, from what I've read, believe was critical to a small community functioning well.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. And I really appreciate Brooke's comment in the chat as well about partnerships. I feel it would be really great if both of you had an opportunity to view the conversation this afternoon, where both Emily and Marianne were talking about Yellow Springs. I think there's a lot of fruitful conversation there that you might appreciate. And it'd be good to probably have a follow-up glass of wine or a cup of tea, depending on the time of day, to just explore. What else? There you go, Brooke.
I just wanted to say, I really appreciate what Kevin is saying about small community. And I think that the larger and larger that our worlds become, and the more the less place-based our networks become, the more that people might start to hunger for some of the nice things that come with living in small communities where you know each other's names. I think that is an area of, I'll use the word growth for Yellow Springs, and you can interpret that word whichever way you want to. But I think, it's also one of the things that Antioch, I believe, has as a strength, is that we have this taproot in a very small, pretty wonderful community where everything is walkable, where people know each other. But you also have co-op as a young person to sort of catapult out into the world and then sort of come back to a place that feels, probably eventually something like home. And over the decades, we see people come back and make Yellow Springs their home, right? So I really appreciate that small scale thinking. And I think that, over the next 50 years, we're going to see, yes, everyone has been moving to the cities, but I think we're going to see that kind of come back. And I wanted to say about the comment about partnerships. A long time ago, I went through the Yellow Springs Community Foundation Leadership Institute. At the time, it was like a 9-month training program, and we had UD professors come in and train us on critical path, strategic project planning, and we had people come in and give multiple psychology tests and talk about how to different psychologies, different tendencies and proclivities play out in the workplace. We had everything over like it was a 9-month period. And one of the things that came up there that has fascinated me since, and I've done no work on it, but the idea of meta organizations, right? How can a meta organization, which maybe is what something like the Yellow Springs Development Corporation aspires to be, I don't actually know much about it, but the idea that a meta organization could somehow strategically connect the missions of the independent organizations into something that could move everything forward, get all the gears in alignment so that everybody's turning the same gears. I think part of the danger in small communities where everyone has big ideas is that we're developing parallel strategies that are all kind of pushing towards the same goal, but we're oftentimes operating relatively independently, even if we're in communication, which can lead to rather than resource sharing, it can lead to, maybe resource competition, right? And some competition I actually kind of think is maybe good, but secondly, I wanted to mention, some time ago, I used to cover the Yellow Springs schools as a writer for the Yellow Springs News. So I would go to every board meeting and they had a chair and I read the whole board packet. And one of the conversations, this was 15 years ago already, one of the conversations that came up there was resource sharing between districts, right? Sorry for my dog. And I think that conversation is so relevant today when the community is really assessing, we have levy on the table and there's conversations going everywhere and nowhere. But those are two different ways of thinking about meta level strategies, meta level collaborations. And I wonder one of the things that strikes me about Arthur Morgan is that he essentially initiated many of the organizations and entities that continue to this day. So he didn't have to do the same kind of reverse engineering that we have to in making our boards kind of sync up together. And so I just wonder, are there resources in his writings that might suggest, possible ways of doing that? I don't know, but I'm glad to be reading him actually, because while he's been a figure in the imagination of the community that I've, come to adulthood and had my entire professional career in, I haven't really read his works directly. So I think I'm going to reread to that question. Are there resources in his work that could suggest how we might do that today with that sense of small scale community?
Thank you so much, Brooke. And I want to say how much I appreciate our relationships with Antioch professors and students and staff. They're among our best partners. So we're so grateful that you're here. In April, I would like to say, again, thank you for all the fine work that you did on behalf of Antioch as part of this conference. We have 5 minutes left. I guess I would like to make a plug also for the water conference that I mentioned. I can put up the link again if that's helpful to folks. That's in 3 weeks from now, and we're really excited about that. Any final comments, Dawn? It looks like you would like to say something.
I'm curious. There are traditional Antioch alumni events coming up still in the next week, or is this the end of it? Isn't this the beginning of an alumni week?
I think it is. I don't know if April wants to say anything because she's in a coughing.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Excuse me if I start coughing. I just got a bad cold today. This is Anti-October, as we're calling it. So the month is just chock full. A volunteer work project was here last week, and this event is part of Anti-October. And then the last 2 weeks are the official reunion events.
And so those are listed on the the college website, and I could maybe pluck a few things out of there and beg access.
Yes, I mean technically it's for alumni, but you know, people who are interested can join for sure.
Thank you, April and Dawn. And Rose just reminded me that I forgot to mention that we have a land access workshop next weekend, including conversations with Community Land Trust in Dayton and land banks in Springfield or Clark County and Montgomery County. So for people who are interested in land access, I think Rose is going to put a link, or she did put a link on the side there. Any closing comments? Have a few more minutes. I'm so grateful. This is like far richer. I was expecting it to be amazing conversation, but far richer than I even dreamed. So thank you, everyone, the wonderful panelists, wonderful planning committee, Ray Gu for beaming in from across the planet.